Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to wait to let the attendees drop in. You've quite a rogue gallery in front of you for people dropping into the room. Slightly different to our usual webinar setup.
Indeed.
Welcome, everyone. I see a few crisp colleagues on here. I see a few homebrewers.
Splendid.
Nice to have everyone along. I see some Harriet Watt students as well. Welcome. Great to see. Hopefully everybody out there has got a beer in front of them and is ready to taste along with us. If you don't, then I'm not entirely sure how exciting this is going to be for you in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I'm going to get my first one poured.
Yeah, I couldn't resist any longer.
So for everyone that's watching, we're going to kick off with this saison. We will do a round of introductions first, but by all means, do open a beer. I mean, if you bought the box, then you've got 12 to choose from. So good stuff. Welcome, everyone. I think we will start. So thanks for joining us on this live tasting event. It's a little bit odd and strange, and because we can't be in the pub together, unfortunately.
Indeed.
Well, I suppose when we planned it, we were assuming that we couldn't be in the pub together. In reality, we probably could, but certainly not with all these people all over the country. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. And by way of quick introductions, I'm Colin Johnston from Crisp Malt. I've also got two Crisp colleagues on the screen, Mike Benson and Carl Heron, our resident brewing team. We have two Robs, which can get very confusing. So we've got Rob Gilmore from Flavourly. We've got Rob Percival from Lallemand.
Evening.
And we've got Kevin Mclaughlin from, he's got his Getterbrood and Hilden hat on, and he's also kind of representing Hilden, who did the actual brewing in the brewery. So we've got quite a panel in front of us here from a couple of different places. I'm going to launch a bit of a slideshow just so we can do a quick introduction around the companies and who we actually are and what we do. So I'm going to pass very quickly to Rob P. to introduce who Lallemand are and why they're here.
Hi, good evening, and thanks, Cole. Yeah, so just as a means of introduction as to who I am and the company, Lallemand. My name is Rob Percival. I've been with Lallemand for 5 years now, background in kind of brewing quality and production roles. And at Lallemand, we're involved in essentially anything involving yeast and bacteria. So this might include everything from kind of winemaking, distilling, of course, brewing, right through to things like health solutions, probiotics. So the company dates back from the 19th century, and its really involvement in brewing started in the 1970s, producing beer yeast for homebrew kits. And then really from the 1990s onwards, we've invested a lot of resource and investment into developing a specialized range of yeast and nutrients for the brewing industry. And it's these yeasts we're going to focus on this evening. So we supplied 3 different yeasts for these 3 beers we're going to taste, and I look forward to taking you through how they're all different.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. By way of quick introduction to Crisp, I'm going to nominate someone. Carl?
Yep, certainly. Hi, Carl Heron from Crisp. I look after the craft brewers in the east of England. And yeah, a little bit about Crisp. It was established in 1862 by a guy called Frederick Smith, who was actually had a farm, and he was milling and realised that it was a lot more lucrative to malt the cereals, and so got into malting. And then I think probably one of the first people to start exporting malt. I mean, Norfolk, where we're based, is a wonderful place to grow malting barley because of the soil and because of the climate. Quite a long intervening years, there were certainly a lot of malt houses built. I think we had 28 at one time. Some of those got flattened in the war, unfortunately, but some survived. Number 19 still stands today. That's in North Norfolk near Fakenham. In 1962, John Crisp took over the business and actually invested in the plant and put some new bits of kit in and made it more modern. And then right up to today, now we have 8 production sites in 4 different countries. So we've got 3 in England, 2 in Scotland, there's 1 in Germany, and there's 1 in Poland.
Show the map there, where we are.
So
So
that's it. So that's where we are.
Good stuff.
Yep.
And to Rob G from Flavourly.
Oh, hello. I am the senior buyer and get stuck in our ops and do loads of silly stuff. We e-commerce beer company based in Edinburgh. You will be familiar with them. You have just bought a box of beer from us, so I hope you're familiar with us. I'm curious about how you got the beers if you're not. We work with a range of people, from Getterbrood. I think this conversation is probably a really good example of how we kind of operate. We get stuck in the middle of really interesting conversations and then find ourselves with some beers that we probably shouldn't have, which we're more than delighted to have. And so it's been quite an exciting project. I don't know how many of us are there involved in this project. There's us at Flavourly, Hilden, Hillstone, Getterbrood, Chris Maltings, Lalamand. The list kind of goes on. So we're kind of lurking in the background of this, but hopefully you all enjoy the beers because I think the guys have done a really great job on. So
good stuff. Kevin Mclaughlin from Getterbrood. Jonathan Mitchell couldn't be with us unfortunately this evening, so Kevin is acting as proxy. You can do a quick introduction to who Getterbrood are, Kev.
Right. Hi. I'm Kevin. I'm currently the head brewer at Hillstone Brewery, which is partially owned by John Mitchell, who owns Getterbrood. They started out, Jonathan and Deborah, just a few years ago, started out just selling online from their attic. And then they've moved premises a couple of times now. They've now doubled their warehouse space just in the last year. They started out just more home brew, but it's now where they supply 60% of the craft breweries in Ireland, and then also sell brewing equipment. So several of the last new breweries that have opened up in Ireland, we've set them up with the brewing equipment. We've installed it, trained them how to use it, and then sold them the ingredients as well. So it's basically during the lockdown, things have went mental in the craft brewing. I mean, 10 times the orders going in. During the first sort of 5-6 weeks of lockdown, I found myself, the brewery work had dried up, and I found myself up at Getterbrood packing boxes of home brewed ingredients. So it's crazy, and it's not slowed down yet either. So
good. There we go.
It's going well.
It might be one of the silver linings of this crisis is that the massive expansion of home brewing in the UK. I think home brew kits are a bit like
hopefully people.
So good stuff. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for doing the introduction. So this is the tasting order, the slide that's up just now. We're going to go Saison, Quebec, and then onto the Chevalier. And as we go through each of the beers, taste along, we're going to be sharing a little bit about some of the ingredients that have gone into the beers. That's what we're principally here to do, and how those ingredients affect the flavours, a little bit about the recipe as well. The actual recipe kits, if you're homebrewers, are available to buy as a complete kit from Getterbrood. You can pick them up on their website at getterbrood.com. But we're kicking off with the Saison, and the Saison recipe was heavily designed by Mr. Mike Benson. So I'm going to go to Mike and to tell us a little bit about the Saison style, because you did a fair bit of research around this, didn't you, Mike?
Yeah, I did a little bit, 10 minutes or so. Yeah, so the main thing that was going after with the Saison was trying to keep it nice and spicy and keep it kind of traditional as what it would have been on the farm when they were first brewed. So grist-wise, we try to keep it with standard malts that you'd have got over on the continent at that time. So we've got the nice German Pils and what we could put into it. Quite heavy on wheat. A little bit of torrefied oats. Some crystal in there just to kind of bump the caramelness. Generally, you'd have had direct fired coppers, so you'd have got a little bit more caramel flavours coming through.
Yeah.
And then we also had a little bit of torrefied buckwheat left over. So again, really adding to that little bit of spiciness that comes through. And when we're tasting it, the aroma's pretty much mainly taken over by the yeast, but you really do get the spiciness coming through on the aftertaste.
You do, definitely.
You do, Matt, yeah.
Yeah, the lovely fruitiness on it. I
Yeah.
love the esters. Really, really nice.
Carl, can you tell us a little bit about the effect of the German Pils malt in this recipe?
Yeah, I mean that's a continental barley. So this is mainly grown in Denmark. This stuff that we buy for Hamburg. So the malting's in Hamburg that I mentioned, and then we produce the Pilsner malt from that. So it's not actually. It's quite a well modified malt. You can throw this stuff in a mash tun at 65 degree and it's quite happy. You don't need to step mash it because it's well modified. But I think it does have a little bit more depth and personality than, let's say, an English spring lager malt. So that's why we chose it. And obviously we want to kind of stay true to that continental malt flavour as well. So that's why we chose to use this one.
Good stuff. And we've also got a torrefied buckwheat in there as well, Carl, don't we?
Yes, indeed. I mean, we made this quite a while ago. I think it was Abbeydale Brew that kind of asked for it. And then we've just made another batch just now. And it's really interesting. Buckwheat, in actual fact, isn't a cereal. It's a pseudo cereal. And the seeds are like little triangles and little pyramids. And they are used in Brittany quite a bit to make whiskey and beer. And it's gluten-free. And we've discovered through mashing in the lab that we can use up to 25% of the grist. And I think certainly tasting this, it's brought that kind of earthy spiciness.
Yeah.
So if you kind of think rye, but a little bit more rustic, then that's what buckwheat does in a beer. And we're going to do some more beers with it and get those about for people to taste if you're interested. So yeah.
Good stuff. So as you taste along, folks, do drop some comments into the chat window. There's way too many people for everyone to have their cameras on, but give us your comments, and if you get any questions about the recipes as we go along, then give us a shout. Whether it comes down to temperatures of mashing or fermentation or anything like that. But obviously with the saison, a major contributing factor when it comes to flavour is indeed the yeast. So this one I will throw to Mr. Percival on this one, the Belle Saison.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. And firstly, fantastic job, guys, on the grist composition. I'm really impressed. So I'm tasting these beers live, as it were. I chose to save them for our tasting, so this is all new to me. But you know, I absolutely love saison beers. So these traditional Belgian farmhouse beers, and the name, of course, is derived from the seasonal farm workers, the saisonniers, that the name is derived from. So these were very thirst-quenching drinks, and I think you've done a spectacular job of the grist. And fascinated to hear you talk about the buckwheat and how I think that really complements some of the notes that we get through from the yeast. So we've used a typical saison yeast, Belle Saison. We've had this available on the market for commercial and homebrew for quite a few years now, about 7 years or so. And I would say that yeast is one of the defining characteristics of saison. They use a very particular type of yeast, and if we think about what a typical ale yeast is, so Saccharomyces cerevisiae, it only utilizes a relatively short range of, limited range, sorry, of sugars from the brewing wort, whereas this saison yeast is unique in the fact that it is what we refer to as a diastaticus yeast. So it will ferment the usual sugars from the brew house as a Saccharomyces cerevisiae ale yeast would, but it also has a unique feature. It secretes an enzyme, amyloglucosidase, and this enzyme, it chops up all those kind of unfermentable sugars and create simple sugars, and and effectively attenuates fully down. So there are no, or certainly very limited amount of residual sugars left in this beer, and that's a very unique characteristic for Saison yeast, is this diastatic effect. And the result is, with the beer, as I'm sure you can taste, it's quite a dry finish, not necessarily astringent or harsh, but very
no, there's still a sweetness to it almost.
Yeah.
But
It cleans up on the palate really nice, so there's no lingering aftertaste. You just want to go for another drink, which is
It's
great.
still a full-bodied beer as well. Like I say, it is quite dry at the end, but there's still quite a lot of body towards it. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
There is, and I think you've done a great job on the grist composition in that regard. And you'll notice just on the fact sheet there, the kind of overview of this strain, that the fermentation ranges from 13 to 35 degrees Celsius. So this is an incredibly wide range for a fermentation. If we think that a typical ale yeast fermentation might be somewhere between, I don't know, like 16 and 22 C typically, this has a much wider range. And I noticed on the recipe card that Mike had put together that he fermented this, suggested the fermentation. I'm sure Kevin can confirm, but that was done at 28 C, so a nice high temperature. And these beers would have been fermented at these very high temperatures. And then if we consider the flavor and aroma, we have an example. We kind of standardize. We have a flavor wheel that describes all our strains, and you can see on the flavor wheel there that one of the defining flavor descriptors for this yeast is pepper. So I think for a Saison beer, really what you're trying to establish is that nice balance between spicy notes, and we may broadly refer to these flavor compounds as phenolic compounds. So if we think of more kind of peppery spice, maybe clovey, a bit medicinal, those group of phenolics, and we balance those out with esters. Quite often with Saisons I get, and particularly this yeast strain, the Belle Saison, I get a slight kind of lemon peel note to it, a touch, not necessarily acidic, but kind of a waxy lemon kind of a character to it. But I think on this beer and smelling it, if we actually just appreciate the aroma on it, it's got, you certainly get that spiciness and that slight clovey character from this phenolic compounds. But I think you also get the ester profile coming through. And Carl, I think you said it's you got the esters coming through, and it's almost like a kind of bubblegummy ester to it. So you get that kind of bubblegum and spice, and it all works really well together. So also a key thing to note is that with this being highly attenuated, and you have that kind of dry finish, that nice refreshing finish to it. I think these beers, and I think that the brewing, congratulations to Kevin and Johnny and the team, that you really need the high carbonation with a Saison style beer. It has to be refreshing. And if we think like a German Hefeweizen, for example, we want and expect a high carbonation, and you should with a Saison, it should have that effervescence to it. I think beers, particularly when they're phenolic like this, is when they're kind of flat or undercarbonated, it becomes very unbalanced and a bit unpalatable. But I think the balance here between the kind of body from the malts and that dryness, and then that lovely aroma of spice and earthiness.
Spice and fruit and earth, yeah.
It's great.
Really,
so I love this yeast. I mean, it's got a reputation, obviously, for being a bit of an animal, because it chews through all those complex sugars and dries it out. And I think this is my first Saison of 2020, and I'm delighted to say it's a great one.
It's the nicest one I've ever tasted. It's a really good one.
We've had a couple of
I'm not a
well done. Well done.
couple of comments. Just, one, Anthony, thanks, from Lincoln Green Brewery, saying he's loving it. It's certainly quite a high ABV. Do we think that it would work at a lower ABV as well, this specific grist and yeast? I guess, I mean, would saisons, Rob, would they have been a bit lower in ABV back in the day for the farm workers? I don't know how many hay bales you'd be able to stack after a few 6%ers.
Well, indeed, I think in that respect, I mean, I'm sure they varied a reasonable amount because they were just relatively simple farm beers, and certainly not with the degree of control that we have in modern breweries. But I guess in that sense that they were to keep the farm workers refreshed and things, you'd imagine that they weren't crazy. You'd hope not, although a few a few farming mishaps, but certainly there's a lot that are around the kind of 4 or 5% region, but some do go high, and I actually it's just a personal preference, I think, more than anything. I actually prefer saisons with a bit more ABV, and I think the kind of alcoholic warming as well, if you it kind of works really
well spice,
with
doesn't it?
Exactly, with the spice. It so, and I think that adds to that perception of body that Mike was talking about as well. So I think that's a really nice ABV range, but I guess traditionally they might have been a touch lower.
I think if you did go down to 4.5%, I think as long as you kept the grist, but you use that higher fermentation temperature just to give the complexity, then you get away with it at that ABV.
Yeah.
And that would work, for sure.
Julie said that they had a saison for Pomona Island, which was 6.8, but didn't taste it, but just felt it afterwards. So it's, I think the drinkability on this is very good. What I'm now realizing is that I've only brought one glass, so this could be quite interesting.
You got to finish that one first, Colin.
So I think we'll move on at this point. Hopefully everybody's had a good taste of the saison and that you enjoyed it. I put in the chat window there, if anybody wants the recipe cards, then do drop us a line, get in touch. Mike has disappeared. Cool.
We'll be back.
We'll move. Oh, there he is.
Sorry about that. The dog needed attention.
Fair enough. the perils of evening webinars. Here we go. Okay, we're moving on to the crazy Quebec.
Just before we go on to the Quebec, Kevin, do you want to give us any insight into the brew day for the beer, and have you brewed saisons before? Is this something you usually do, and what did you kind of experience?
No, it's saisons at our Helsdon brew. We don't do saisons. We do. We have a Belgian triple as part of our core range, which we use the Abbey yeast. But saisons, this is my first time doing a saison since homebrewing, so it was good to do. It's not a beer style I normally drink, so it was interesting to do again, but it turned out really well. I had a bottle straight off the bottle line, brought some home to my wife, who was more of the saison drinker of the family, and she gave it a thumbs up, so it was good to go then.
That's all good then. I like it.
Good stuff. And the beers were brewed at Hildon Brewery with Owen down there as well, Owen Scullion. So.
Yeah, Owen did the brewing down there, just held down for sheer scale. He was brewing like 7,000 litre batches that were taking me like a week to make that. So
so big shout out, thanks to Owen at Hillstown.
Yeah, Owen did a good job. So
he's done a good job. Yeah, and some of the other Hillstown beers are available through Flavourly. Seems to be a nice partnership developing. Rob Gilmore with the guys down at Hildon.
Yeah, basically, you don't get any gold stars for guessing why we have a decent complement of Irish breweries in our portfolio. I swear to you all, totally coincidental. Prove absolutely nothing. But we've worked with the guys at Hillstown and Hildon for quite a while, even before my time. And it's just two breweries that we keep coming back to on actually, okay, can we get some more beer? They just fit the profile of really great beers that e-commerce seems to really work with, where breweries maybe haven't got the same traction as some of the big shiny lights or breweries that get all the headlines. And then you taste the beers and you think, wow, why is nobody drinking these? Or why is nobody talking about these? Obviously people are drinking them, but let's go and push these beers out. So it's actually
that's great, Rob. That's a good thing to do.
Project.
I think I think one of the attributes there is because of drinkability. And that's probably something we'll come back to with all three of these beers.
There's a particular type of balance through this range that you kind of find yourself, even with this beer being at 6%, like while it's got a nice body to it, there's no kind of sense of like an alcohol kick or a point where you go, actually this beer is
no,
indeed. Much.
Yeah, it warms, but it doesn't burn. You're absolutely right. Yeah, it's really, really pleasant.
So how much interest is there, Rob? I mean, in saisons, I mean, they're a fascinating style to talk about, and they've been very integral in the kind of UK craft brewing scene previously. I'd say we've seen them kind of not fall out of fashion as such, but we don't seem to see as many around as we did, but it's a wonderful style.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. Where we sit within the market, we tend to bring loads of new people into craft beer. So I suppose a lot of people who would take up a recruitment offer with us, sometimes this is their first experience of beer from small brewery or craft beer, whatever your definition of that is. Some of these people probably think walking into a pub, and no disrespect to any international lagers or premium international lagers, but some of them would see that as a craft beer. So they come and they find us and try the beers. And saisons, obviously, we'd be quite apprehensive about pitching these to our customers. We've just put the 3 beers actually out in our Discovery Club, which would probably be the most adventurous end of it. And the reviews that have been coming through have been really kind of heartwarming. You maybe think that from a commercial point of view, we've maybe been a wee bit conservative and maybe not giving the customer enough credit for how adventurous they're willing to be in terms of styles. So I think there's maybe a resurgence of, styles that we would all consider are out of vogue. So be it bitters or saisons, I think we're going to see a wee bit of a resurgence in them.
I think so. If it tastes like that, for sure. I mean, a few of my customers are making saisons, but I think they've tended to stick to what would kind of be an ale kind of fermentation temperature. They're not going to push the boundaries. And for me, the reason this is so good is because it's not just kind of farmyardy spice. It's got the esters coming up through it. There's that warmth. I think it's fabulous, and that's what I'll be talking to my customers about. Is like, get this yeast, use it, let it ferment, let it develop those esters with a higher temperature on fermentation.
I love beers like this because
really good beer.
It's everything working together. It's not just the big juice hot bomb. It's everything working in tandem to just create something lovely.
Yeah,
it is. There's just that layers of complexity there, which make it a great beer. Yeah.
I could almost imagine having something like this on tap in the little, like the 200 ml Kolsch glass, and just having, and just keep going with them in a way. One technical question actually that's come in is about CO2 volumes for a saison beer like this. If I could throw that out to the panel, and can anyone answer that one? What we're looking for in terms of CO2 saturation?
They tend to be pretty high. If we think, just going back a few years to when I worked in a multinational brewery, just what the CO2 specs were on lagers, but you're generally looking about 5 to 5.2 grams per litre on a kind of standard lager, which probably doesn't mean much to anyone listening without the context, but like, for example, like a cask ale, you'd only have like 1 to 1.5 grams per litre. So a lager would be about 5 to 5.2 grams per litre, whereas with a saison or a Hefeweizen, you're looking at kind of 6 to 7 grams per litre. So they are very highly carbonated, and I guess the only thing to be mindful of that in that respect is bottles and pressure.
Put it in the fridge,
especially if you're pasteurizing.
Yeah, but I think that high carbonation, as we kind of alluded to earlier, is really critical to that effervescence and that kind of freshness to the beer. So I think you've really got to aim for those higher dissolved CO2 levels with this style.
Yeah, I agree with everything Rob said about the CO2 there. Generally, the lagers are around about 2.5 volumes, which is like 5 gram per litre. And then, saisons are up around about 3 volumes, which is 6 gram per litre. like I say,
being the
really lift
crude
it.
Scot on the panel, I can definitely taste it on the sizable burp that I'm getting from the.
Yeah, very good.
On that note, we'll move forward into the crazy Quebec. I hope I've got the pronunciation correct, because this is really exciting because of the Quebec yeast, I would say, which Rob will be able to tell us about in a fair bit of detail. But looking at the actual recipe, it's certainly massively built around the Quebec yeast. In terms of malts, we're on Maris Otter with a good number of our torrefied materials in there as well, and then the Enigma and the Vic Secret hops as well, with a reasonable amount of dry hopping from the Vic Secret, giving sort of some of the orange zest and pineapple characteristics. That's where the recipe sits. But I do
nice.
I'm actually gonna skip over the Maris. We'll come back to the Maris. As much as we, as maltsters, love our Maris Otter, I really do want to dwell more on the yeast on this one, because there's a fantastic story behind it, and Rob's got his nose in the glass.
Oh man, that just
That
smells fantastic. That just is delicious. So we just get the initial impression on the aroma. Yeah, it really kind of punchy orange, like a fruit punch kind of an orangey.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
that's delicious. So
for everyone listening, drop some notes and
mango there as well.
On your on what
mango.
Yeah, that nice ripe mango kind of aroma. So yeah, Kvike. So you nearly pronounced it right.
Almost. Thank you.
I think you're wrong too.
So this is something really new but very old at the same time in the brewing world. And Kvike is a Norwegian word. I mean, there's kind of two senses of the word. It, in one way, means kind of to quicken and to breathe new life into something, and the other is quite a literal kind of meaning for yeast. So the Kvike refers to the specific organism that's fermented, and it is a Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast. So it can be in some senses considered an ale yeast. So this is a fascinating story that it really reflects, in some ways, a bit like the Saison beers in which they were farmhouse beers in Belgium that relied on these kind of domestic native yeasts with unique characters. In a similar way that we see this happening in Norway, and the Kvike is unique to Western Norway, and they were yeast strains that were shared in between farms. So just very small scale farmhouse brewing. They would pass on cultures from one to the next. You can see that just a picture on the slide there of Sigmund Jerners, who originally maintained the strain that we've produced in this beer. And you see in his hand there is a kind of wooden ring. It's spiked and barbed, and the farmhouse brewers would skim the yeast using this kind of ring or a wooden stick, and the yeast would dry out. They would hang it from the rafters of the farm and pitch it, cast it into their next brew. So these have survived for centuries, if not millennia, from just being passed down from generation to generation. And they've been largely untouched by the industrialization and the commercialization of brewing that happened in the kind of mid-19th century onwards, and when we start to get things like Louis Pasteur and Emil Hansen doing the first pure culture techniques for yeast. And this part of Norway was untouched. So we have these wonderful yeasts that have been preserved just by tradition in Norway. And it's crucial to say Kvike is not one strain of yeast. It's a very diverse group of yeasts, and they have very different characters. And we isolated a specific one from Voss, which is in the kind of southwest of Norway. So can we go back to just the strain overview, Carl, please? So there's this great story behind that Kvike is a kind of more recent rediscovery, and the really strange character of these yeast strains is they ferment at phenomenally high temperatures. So we talked about the Saison and the beer had been brewed at 28C for the saison. Now, these strains will work at a standard ale temperature, 20C, and they'll ferment and behave kind of just like a standard yeast, but they really come into their own. You can see the fermentation range there. They really start to do their thing at about 35 to 40C. And crucially with Voss, its optimal temperature is pretty much bang on 40, or I think 39, I think some of the Norwegian brewers stipulate, but suffice to say, incredibly warm, and you get complete fermentation, complete attenuation within 48 hours, which is the stuff of
24 hours.
It's 24 hours. It's the stuff of like brewers' dreams, really. So they're a bit of a freak in that respect, but normally when we ferment at very high temperatures, we'd get all these off flavors, kind of stress related flavors, maybe kind of like sulfur, higher alcohols, diacetyl, and the yeast would be stressed out, and it would let you know. You'd get all these weird and wonderful aromas and flavors. But with the Kveik, the higher temperatures phenomenally clean. So
it is.
you see on the flavor wheel there, it's got quite a neutral character to it, but it does have a slight and a very specific kind of fruity note to it as well. And specifically with Voss, a lot of people describe that almost as like a kind of orange peel, slightly spiced orange note. Not spicy like we were referring to the saison yeast, but just a very kind of warming orange, or kind of a marmalade-y note to it. And I think that in this beer works perfectly well with those Vic Secret hops. So I think that the brewing team and putting the recipe together have done a great job of marrying what you get from the yeast with those hops as well. That really comes through, and I love it when the kind of yeast notes, particularly kind of fruity esters, marry with these modern hop varieties to create a very three-dimensional fruitiness. But I don't know if anyone else agrees, but with a lot of these Kveik beers that I've tried recently, especially, it's proving a very popular option for IPA styles. I get a slight, on the taste, it's quite, I wouldn't say sharp and acidic necessarily, but it's got a kind of...
I think it's an extremely clean finish. It's quite a...
Very clean and not necessarily... Slight tanginess to it. Not acidic, not like you'd describe a sour beer, but...
but it has got a slight tang, you're right.
The tanginess, I mean, it's not a super dry finish either. It's a targeted final gravity of 9 SG points. So, but it's surprising just how drying it actually is. We have a wee question here, Rob, on fermentation temperatures when it comes to Kveik. So, is that going to be a natural rise, or does it need a little encouragement? Anthony's asking.
Question. I was going to ask that.
Good question, Anthony, and thanks for that. It does, of course, it will rise in temperature, so it's probably somewhat dependent on what your starting pitch temperature would be. So generally speaking, we've been kind of recommending a pitch at about 35C, and that will kind of rise up to about 40, into the low 40s. So it does seem to create a reasonable amount of heat on its own, but obviously it's only going to create so much. So if you factor in, obviously, your pitch rate and then letting it go from there, you can kind of work out a rough kind of target range of where it's going to free rise to. And typically, I'd say, you'd expect just letting it go, see somewhere between, 5 to 7 degrees C rise. So, just adjust the starting pitch temperature accordingly.
So, another question there from Ian. How do you oxygenate? How do you oxygenate the water if the pitch temperature is so high? So that's like a question about dissolved oxygen is better at lower temperatures.
We don't.
Nobody does. There we go. Well, not nobody, but
no, we don't. We pitch it or we transfer it in at about 38 degrees with no oxygenation and a little bit of yeast nutrients, and it just ticks up. Generally,
Yeah,
like I say, it's a crazy yeast. I've had at times I pitch it, and before I've even finished my clean down and got out the brewery, it's already started kicking off. It is crazy.
What's the what does the pitch rate have to do with any of the tropical fruits coming through, Rob? Is it does the lower pitch rate and trying to stress it out a little bit more encourage any of that, or is it?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Mike, and it's one that's talked about a lot in the kind of Kvike circles and amongst the Norwegian brewers, is that they tend to suggest a lower pitch rate as you say, would bring out that kind of fruity character. And when we think about esters, so those fruity kind of solventy notes that we get in beers, they're all linked to kind of yeast growth. So generally speaking, a lower pitch rate and a higher temperature would result in this overexpression of the esters. But it seems to, I mean, that being said, and this is something we're doing a lot of R&D on, is the correlation between pitch rate and some of the compounds that it's producing. But I think more anecdotal, more than backed up with any data at this point, it seems very consistent across the kind of temperature range and the pitch rate range. Not seeing much variance, but I think to go back to that oxygenation question again, specifically with these dry yeast products that we produce at Lalliman, the way in which we produce them, so we grow them up in the lab, propagate them from slants, do kind of sequential sized propagations into a large fermentation. We actually fix the yeast and they go on to drying when the sterile content of the yeast is very high. And obviously it's sterols that the oxygenation will promote and subsequently yeast growth. So the yeast that we're providing to the brewery is already very high in sterile content anyway. So to a certain extent, that negates the need to oxygenate anyway. So I hope
that's going to help.
all the answers.
Awesome.
There, yeah.
I think it's really interesting and purely happenstance that strain, that specific Voss strain, has been maintained since the 1980s, because when it comes to the key malt in this beer, it's Maris Otter, which is celebrating its 55th anniversary this year.
Indeed.
Another, not a dissimilar age in terms of the yeast. Carl, perhaps you could just give us a very brief sort of tour of its contribution, and not just to the brewing world, but to this specific recipe.
Yeah, indeed. So, I mean, Maris is, I guess, the most recognised heritage variety now. There are older ones that we produce, but I think this one is so well loved worldwide, because it's an older strain, like Colin said, it's old as me, 1965, and it just has that kind of depth and biscuit malty sweetness, which I think really helps beers like this, because it gives it a backbone, and that's why people love it. And the other thing is it's really forgiving in the brew house, so it's got a wide range of temperatures that it'll operate at and give you predictable extract and so on, but also it just gives you that flavour. And it will behave itself and come down to the attenuation, the final gravities you're looking for will always be predictable. But it does have that backbone, which I think helps with, big IPAs, session IPAs, bitters, the whole range, I think. But it's nice to taste it in this, because I've never tasted it in this style, and it's very nice. So, yeah.
It's amazing with Otter. You as you go through anything with brewing, there's always the conversation of, is it overrated or what you've got, and it's kind of like 50-50 as you go through with where people are with it. But when going round and seeing the customers that we do, and when you get to see the beers that are made with Maris, they do have something else to them, especially say some of the bigger ones. It's a great malt.
We looked into it, we looked at the GBBF, winners and the SIBA National Beer Competition winners, and there seems to be a higher percentage of winners that use Maris Otter as a base. Now, whether that's got anything to do with it or it's just the styles that seem to come through, I don't know. I've not studied that, but there is definitely a correlation between winners and Maris Otter. Maybe that's something.
I think
in the last couple of months,
Go
Sorry,
on.
Colin.
Yeah, no, go on.
I'll say in the last couple of months, the number of the amount of Morris Otter going out to Getterbrood has just skyrocketed, and some of the guys in the warehouse they couldn't understand why is Morris Otter suddenly really rocketed compared to the other grains, until I pointed out that every homebrew book ever written uses Morris Otter, and it makes so much up there. It's so common.
Because
So
it's easy to brew.
Homebrewing grows, Morris Otter grows in that. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed.
Oh,
I must say, I did a homebrew last Tuesday with Otter, and it was just went through beautifully. There's no worries with it.
I spent most of my brewing career using Morris Otter, and it's I think, as Carl said, it's really forgiving. It's so easy to use. You can just get fantastic results. It's so consistent, and I think once you've started brewing with it, it's very hard to move away from it.
Indeed.
We have a fantastic group of farmers local to us as well at the Maltons in Ryborough that grow the Maris, and I think because it's been going for so long, they really know how to handle it as well. When it's a barley plant in the ground, they know which fields it's going to work in. They know how to really get the best result out of it as a variety. So long may it continue. That's what I can say.
I'm absolutely sure it will. Yeah. I
Um,
picked up some yesterday, actually. I was down at Barsham Brewery, and Barsham's quite a big estate in North Norfolk. It's about 8 miles from the brewery. And what we've agreed with them is they have got the brewery, they've got the land, the fabulous land to grow Morris Otter on. And I've always wanted to do the grain to glass thing. So we said, look, we can do a minimum of kind of 6 tons for you. So we could take 8 tons of barley in. We get 6 tons of barley out the other end because of the malting losses. And they cannot wait to get that barley malted and back to the brewery and start making it. And it's causing lots and lots of interest with both customers and the press. I think it's a really fantastic thing for them. So, looking forward to that.
Awesome. It's really interesting to reflect on that. Just when we've been thinking about the saison, the saison style is so intimately connected to the farming calendar, and I think it should be true of barley varieties. We've got this great connection back to our local farmers in the local Norfolk area. I think that's really something to be celebrated. It's a tradition that really does go back, hundreds and hundreds of years of the farms and the maltsters and the brewers, and indeed the distillers all being, quite intimately connected.
That's it.
Yeah. So there we go.
I'll have to encourage Rob to make a saison and then share it with the guys on the farm and make a big thing of it. That'd be great. Yeah.
Anthony says that big fans of Morris Otter and love the fact that Crisp is 100% Otter and not a blend. So there we go. Yeah, good stuff.
Thanks, Anthony. Cool. Like it.
Good stuff. I think Kev, have you got any comments on the brewing of the Voss? You touched on that a little bit.
Well, we've used Voss quite a lot actually. We ferment about 38 degrees. And I say it's generally, I used it on an Imperial Stout, and I think it dropped about 80 points in 36 hours.
Wow.
I mean, it was
awesome.
Just the only thing we have to be aware of when we're doing it is leave plenty of headroom, because when it goes crazy at that kind of temperature, at that kind of speed, it can foam over and blow out through your airlock. But apart from that, I've recently used it as well. We tried a new technique for souring. So instead of a kettle sour, we tried to do a fermentation tank sour. So we were using Helveticus in the tank with the cavity. So both of them working together at 38 degrees, kind of maintain each other over 24 hours, and then enough flavour with hops. So which works. There's so many different uses for it, and just of course you can use it so you can bang out beers really, really quickly. But there's much more uses to it than that.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Rob G, do you think that this is a style that will
it is.
Look, seeing more of?
It's straddling a really nice place in the spectrum of what customers want to get out of beer. Obviously, especially in the IPA category, because you maintain that kind of lovely opaque colour to the beer. Like when you look at it, Kvik, I've pronounced that awfully. Please don't kill me. Whenever you look at one of those IPAs, I've definitely did the worst pronunciation of that on this panel. Apologies. it has that lovely color. It's an attractive style to look at, and we do live in a world of, you know, the Instagram beer drinker. It's almost there for the aesthetic of the beer, but it also, like, I always feel there's a little bit of commonality in terms of the fruit profile and the, like, flavor forward nature of it with New England, which is so stylish at the moment. But there is that little bit of kind of like that cleanness, the aesthetic kind of element that we're all trying to find a nice descriptor for, that just keeps that beer really nice and lifted. It's not flat.
We've a wee question there from Steve, because I was just about to address the cloudiness. It is there, but do remember that there's a fairly heavy dose of non-malted cereals in there, in the recipe. So we've got torrefied wheat, we've got flaked torrefied oats, we've also got malted oats. So it's almost like the grist that you would see in a NEPA, but been done with a Quebec and a different hop. So it's, that's where that cloudiness is.
And then a very heavy dry hop as well.
Yeah.
So there were two
hop haze too.
There are two really good bits of feedback from Owen whenever he'd been fermenting this beer out. One was a learning curve for him, where Owen at Hilden produces a very different style of cloudy beer. So he produces a New England that hasn't got the same level of haze as he was getting out of the Quebec. And his comment on it, the adjuncts in the beer, they were adding so much to it, so I'm going to go and see what I can do with our own. And then also he touched on, Kevin, I had a good laugh whenever you were like, oh, it's crazy. The temperatures just shoot up. Because that was essentially what Owen had said. I had some frantic kind of phone calls going, these beers are going absolutely mental. I don't know if I can chill these back to where I want them. I was like, great.
Owen's never had a beer at 38 degrees in his life. He was panicking.
He
was freaking out of that. The concept of that was blowing his mind. Yeah.
As my last contribution to this beer is that I think the brewing or the fermentation characteristics of this are bizarrely very similar to Scotch whisky wash fermentations. And I know that Struan's on the call tonight, but you know, looking at these fermentation temperatures and looking at the fruit profile of this yeast, I think it'd be absolutely amazing to produce a wash for Scotch whisky.
Well, it might not surprise you to reveal that our distilled spirits division is doing a lot of work on Kvike at the moment.
Good stuff. Struan, give us a thumbs up if you agree. I think we'll move on to number 3. And speaking of heritage with our Maris Otter, then we are into Chairman Chevalier. And the Chevalier part is with reference to the malt, to the Chevalier malt, which is something that has become extremely dear to us at Crisp, as we've revived it over the past 10 years. We want to tell you a little bit of the story of that. I'm just going to skip forward to the slides to do that. There we are. So I'm gonna again throw to Carl, because he is our master brewer after all, to talk a little bit about what Chevalier is.
It's just the original malting barley, which is so exciting because it was before Chevalier was kind of selected. It was a selection, not a kind of cross or anything like that. The maltsters would basically malt landrace varieties. And the story goes that this was discovered in a workhand's garden in his cottage, and the squire of the manor said, "Could you save me a little bit of that, please? I'd like to put it in the ground and grow it again." And that's how it came about, and that's where the Chevalier name came from. So it came from Suffolk. It was discovered there in 1824, I think. Colin, can't remember.
Something in that region. I know that our technical director is on the call, so if we're wrong, he will correct us.
No doubt. Yep. Indeed. Yeah. So what we did probably must be 10 years ago now, Colin, I imagine. We were allowed to take a handful of seeds, probably 5 or 10 seeds from the seed bank at the John Innes Centre in Norfolk, and we worked with them to get that grown up to quantities where we could micromalt it, which took a couple of years. realised that this had massive potential, not only from a kind of brewing perspective, but also in terms of its agronomics, its resistance to disease, and all sorts of things like that. So we've been working in partnership with the John Innes Centre. They've been using it and crossbreeding it back into modern varieties, and we just malted it, tasted it, and thought, wow, this is amazing. It's like Maris Otter, but it's just bigger, deeper, more complex, and it's a great malt to work with. We've done. It's been a limited release, I guess, up until the last couple of years because we've not had very much. I think Colin's got a slide that I just saw there with some of the brews that have been made with it and some of the breweries that we worked with. And now it's being used in all sorts of different beers. When I first started like going out there and telling people about it, I was kind of saying like big IPAs or barley wines, maybe a porter, just let the malt shine. But now there's all sorts of things being brewed with it, and I think it's got great potential in all sorts of different beers. And I think this one will be a good example as well. So yeah.
When Colin first came to see me at my last brewery, and he mentioned it, it was something that kind of just went out over my head because I didn't think it'd fit in with the beers that we were brewing. But then when I actually brewed with it, the flavours and complexity that it brought to the beer, it just lifted everything, even at really small quantities. It's such a great malt.
You can blend it in right enough. Yeah, I mean that works. If you just want to beef up that malty backbone, then this stuff works a treat. But for me personally, it'd be 100% because it's amazing.
You can see there on the slide the Govinda, which was the Cheshire Brewhouse brew produced with 100% Chevalier, which won a few awards recently, and in that recipe it was a 3-hour boil. It was 100% Chevalier, and the color was huge and the flavor was just absolutely massive. But then within our team, we started thinking about how could would the Chevalier characteristics come through on a beer where the contribution was smaller. And so that's kind of where the inspiration for this specific recipe came from. I'm just going to skip back a wee bit there to the recipe card, because you can see there that Chevalier actually only contributes 20% of the total grist bill within this recipe. And the rest is coming from a bit of Munich, a bit of caramalt, and the base is our clear choice pale malt, which has got a nice sort of honey sweetness to it. But it's a really nice base to work.
What's the diastatic power like on this grain? I mean, could you conceivably brew 100% with it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So when
I had in mind for some reason that it was incredibly dark, and maybe it's because I think I tried Shane's Govinda, which I think the 3-hour boil would probably contribute to the to the colour somewhat. But I did a presentation just looking at kind of some old examples of IPAs, and Steve Dunkley at Beer Nouveau, who I know you've worked with quite a bit, had done his stock ale, kind of 19th century stock ale recipe using Chevalier, and it's a very similar colour to this. I love the colour on it, but I can see this working on the kind of big beefy old IPA styles really well.
We used it in a wee heavy once. I worked really well as a wee heavy. Just kind of added extra to the malt bill.
Oh, I bet that was nice.
Yeah.
I love wee heavies. Wee heavies are gorgeous anyway, but with that.
Yeah, it's not added used, but
complexity.
But that style of beer is, Victorian ultimately, and that in that time period, pretty much all of the barley being harvested in the UK for malting was of the Chevalier type.
Indeed.
And that, I think it absolutely proves categorically that variety, terroir, makes a difference when it comes to flavour. It really does. And that's why Maris Otter is so celebrated, and now with Chevalier as well, and with other heritage varieties coming through like Plumage Archer. We've also revived Hana, which is the original Czech Moravian barley, which was used in the very first Pilsner beer
Indeed.
in the mid 19th century. So I think it's fantastic to see these coming back, because the variety, the genetics of the variety, really does make a difference to the flavour.
So would you say that this kind of fell out of growing and production purely because it was, other varieties yielded better? Was it simply the case it just didn't get a great yield?
Absolutely, Rob. I mean, you only need to look at the picture here of the actual crop. Now, all right, there's not somebody standing in the field, and there's not we don't have a picture to the side of it showing a modern variety, but I mean that's coming up to certainly above waist height in terms of value, whereas the modern varieties you need to sort of have a look out in the fields at present when we're reaching mature barley in England, and it's more sort of up to your knees. So that's been one function of modern barley breeding, is bringing it closer to the ground, so it's less susceptible to this idea of lodging, which is when the wind comes along and blows it over. But also just the farm yield itself. We've been driving for 100 years for better farm yields, for better extract,
and not for bloody flavour. That's the thing.
But that idea of what does the genetics give in terms of flavour is perhaps something that's been lower on the list, and I think it's starting to climb back up again, and we're really, really proud as a company to be part of that exploration of flavour. And now with some of the new technologies that we have as well, in terms of like our new RevTech system, which allows us to produce really innovative crystal and roasted malts, taking some of these varieties, putting them through that system and seeing how can we actually play with the genetics and even accentuate those flavors, because Chevalier is quite a high nitrogen, generally yields a high nitrogen. You get all that interplay and then elevate it to perhaps a Munich or a low caramel or something like that. What effect is the variety going to have on it? So I think it's some really exciting things to be had. I think you can tell that we're quite excited about Chevalier, but there's also another fairly major dimension to this beer, and that is the verdant strain IPA yeast, which is brand new. So for those of you with beers in your hand, you're drinking one of the very first beers to be brewed with this strain from Lallemand. So
it might.
Percival, over to you.
It's certainly one of the very first, So this is, as Colin alludes to, something that we were pleased to announce. We've not even released this strain commercially. It's actually being launched next week on the 28th of July. So we're 5 days ahead of its even commercial release, and really excited about this strain. It's been in the pipeline effectively for 2.5 to 3 years. Obviously, as the name suggests, we've partnered, we've collaborated with Verdant, the brewery in Cornwall, to launch this new strain of IPA yeast. And it was the end of 2017. We were in the process of launching our New England strain to the market, and as part of our R&D and launch, we always, obviously, as I'm sure Chris do, get kind of brewers involved for trials to give commercial feedback, etc. So you can really characterize and understand the yeast and get that data back. And they loved the New England strain, and they still brew quite a few of their beers with it. But they said, we have this house strain. We think it would be fantastic, and popular in the market. Would you like to have a look at it? So there was a culture with 3 strains in it: 2 Saccharomyces cerevisiae L yeast, 1 non-sac yeast. Not sure that was meant to be there, but we isolated one of the dominant cerevisiae strains, and that became this IPA yeast. So we have already the BRY 97, which is a West Coast IPA strain, in the New England, which is very much for these kind of more fruity, kind of hazy IPAs, and this sits somewhere in the middle, I think. In the fermentation, you tend to get very fruity notes, peach. To be honest, I'm not picking up the peach note hugely. A slight fruit character, but it's not massively prominent like I've had it on some beers. But what I really think sets this yeast apart, and what I absolutely love about it, and I do think translates into this beer, is the mouthfeel to it. So we think of like a West Coast yeast that is very high attenuating, and we talked about this with the Saison yeast. You get that dry finish. With West Coast IPA, you want them to be bitter, you want them to be astringent and dry. Whereas this doesn't attenuate quite as high. It's not low, so you don't get that kind of sickly sweetness, but you get almost the kind of smooth mouthfeel. And I described the finish as soft, and that's an odd descriptor in some ways, but it's not harsh, it's not astringent, nor is it sweet and sticky, but it's just a soft finish to the beer. And if you think the way that IPAs are going, then they're not nearly as bitter in preference, but they're a lot more aromatic. And in terms of mouthfeel and finish, they're a lot kind of smoother and drinkable. And what I think this yeast delivers more than anything is drinkability.
It does, for sure.
Fantastic. I've just asked the question what people's favourites were, and it's okay. We've only got 3 questions. Yeah, right. Quebec, Saison, Quebec.
So what you were going for?
I went for Saison.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have the Quebec for you, Kev. Okay,
Yeah, Quebec, yeah.
I think the Quebec.
Once Valley, I think.
They were close. It were close for sure.
Yeah, I really admire this Saison. I think that was so well executed.
Likewise.
It's a great Saison, yeah. It turned out really well.
I think like the subtleties, and I think Mike's done a great job on the design of the backbone, and it's been really well brewed. I do have a soft spot for the Kvike.
It's just an incredible yeast. It just adds all that complexity, and I think the higher temperature fermentation just brings things to it. Just unique, very unique.
I love that yeast. It's brilliant. It's so easy to
use. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to see to take a pitch of or to take a cast rather, of a NEPA and split it into 2 tanks and do one on on the New England IPA yeast and do the other one on the Kvike.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be interesting to brew with them both. What do you reckon of that, Rob? Split the strains. Yeah.
Blend them together, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like blending strains and co-fermentation is a really interesting concept, and I think there's going to be more and more of that. But we do things like this in the past, and we've worked with a few breweries that have the ability to split the wort, like Glen Affric Brewery who are in Liverpool. They actually have a 20 hec brew length that can be split into 5 vessels, and we're looking at doing pretty much exactly that with IPA at the minute. So looking at the Verdant versus the West Coast versus the Kvike on the IPA, because they do some great IPAs with the Kvike yeast as well. So that'd be really nice to do a vertical tasting with those different fermentations. But hopefully, I mean, I'd say congratulations to the brewing team. I think you've managed to distinguish all the ingredients and the characteristics of the styles really well, and hopefully people tasting them can appreciate just the impact that these different raw materials have on the beers, because you get them just such different flavors, bodies, textures, aromas coming through. This is been a really interesting tasting for me. So
for sure. Me too.
Kevin.
Be great couple, and then everyone can homebrew it as well.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it, isn't it? Yeah.
The bit that we did was dead easy. It's the brewing that's the hard bit. So well done. It's as simple as that, isn't it?
No, fabulous. Really good.
What a fantastic example as ever of the collaborative and the bonhomie that exists in the industry. You've got suppliers and brewers and also retailers working together to bring you fantastic beers. So, hopefully there'll be more projects to come out of this, who knows, and long may it continue. thanks everybody for their involvement this evening, for sitting in front of a laptop camera and drinking some beers. And if you've not had
hard work.
Really enjoyed it, mate. To be honest,
the webinar should be more like this, Colin.
Yeah. Usually do them during working hours.
Let's do them all with a beer. That's a good idea.
Really good. So thank you to both Robs, to Carl, to Mike, and to Kevin. And I think we'll end it there. If you've not yet finished your beers, then enjoy them over the course of the evening and over the weekend. Thank you so much. If you so desire to watch this again, then you can. It will be available online on YouTube. But if you want recipe cards or any more information, then do email us to get in touch through social media or through the websites or whatever. And if you want to buy the recipe kits, then you can get them from Getterbrood.com. And if you think the beers were absolutely fantastic, then also please encourage your friends to order some more cases from Flavourly.com.
Indeed.
Great.
Go on. Please.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.
We'll see you for another
Cheers, guys.
webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Good evening.
A pleasure.
Cheers.
Good night.